Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you. So in today's episode, or in preparation for it, the three of us have been really steeped in these issues and images of immigrants and the children of immigrants and the way this is happening in the United States. And we wanted to lift this into an archetypal level. So one of the frames that we feel is really relevant is the idea of the scapegoat. And so we're going to put that on the table for today's discussion, and working our way down from the archetypal to the most personal levels, we'll begin by talking about the archetype of the scapegoat.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading up on this actually because I find it really interesting, and it certainly is very relevant in my practice, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So what I found out about the scapegoat was that this ritual was originally part of the Yom Kippur observance. And what I understand is that there would be two goats chosen. One goat would be, I suppose, killed and then burnt in sacrifice to Yahweh. And the second goat would have the sins of the community ritually placed on its head, and then it would be driven by a priest, and then it would be driven into the wilderness, sort of carrying away the sins of the community. And the really interesting thing is that initially the wilderness was considered to be the territory of Azazel, who was this, I think, kind of primitive god, who I have the sense that Azazel was sort of similar to the Greek god Pan, actually, which also is a goat connection. But apparently Azazel was initially the god that was associated with aggression and sexuality. And, he sort of evolved into more of a kind of devilish figure over the centuries. But initially it didn't really carry that. It was sort of a nature god. And so there was this sense that the sins were going back out into the realm in which they belonged, So it was a way of kind of regulating the community and ritually purifying it every year and putting this material back where it belonged. And we'll talk in a minute about sort of what do we mean when we say that material. But that's my understanding of the actual ritual.
So I find it interesting that there were two goats.
Yes.
And it feels like there's a polarity here archetypally, and that's true of archetypal material.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bipolarity, and one goat was sacrificed to Yahweh, so it rose up on high, as it were.
Yeah.
And then the other was the shadow side. We have yet to discuss shadow, but sent out into the wilderness of unassimilated material. So it seems like there's a bright side or a sacred side, and then a profane side.
Yes.
As I'm sitting with what you're saying, I'm thinking about the whole trajectory of civilization and the way in which part of being civilized is deciding what attitudes and behaviors are acceptable and promote the social good, whether it's an ancient culture or a modern culture, And what are the mechanisms that the ancient part of the psyche that taps into these archetypal structures activates in order to decide what will be sent away in the human psyche and what will be clustered around home and business and community. So one of the things that I'm imagining, if this comes from the ancient Hebrew practices, is that the Ten Commandments kind of became the paradigm for what was expected to be claimed for civilized society, and perhaps the things that were going to be put away or put back into the wilderness.
Right. And yes, and that this would be sort of a symbolic means of regulating this. And of course, that which is profane that we send back into the wilderness would map onto what is considered to be shadow.
It's interesting that it's sent back into the wilderness. It's not assimilated. It's not brought into consciousness. Okay, let's really think about this together and what's gone wrong here. It's exiled.
But it's not welcomed. It's not made into a friend of some
However,
kind.
and I think this is really important, I think that's true, but it is given back to its rightful place in a transpersonal context. So I think it's important that it's not just driven into the wilderness, just sort of out there into nothingness. It's given back to Azazel.
So let's just sit with that. So are you imagining that, so the goat which is accused of the crimes of the tribe goes into the desert, and it's going to die, of course. It's going to die of exposure or predation, and that returns it, or it's remetabolized by the ancient god, as if the ancient god itself is going to gobble up the goat.
Yeah, something like that.
Yes, it goes into the transpersonal realm because it has not been able to be assimilated, given a place in the consciousness of the tribe. So it is cut off and exiled into a non-human or transpersonal.
Well, and in this way, there's this way that the whole right would sort of connect the collective with the divine, both the Yahweh divine up above, but also put it in right relationship with this. This is this big Jungian word that makes you sound really smart, chthonic deity. It's like we've put everything back in its place, right? So there's a way that with this Azazel piece, it does kind of change it for me, because there's just like this whole transpersonal container. And, I'm lifting this up because I think it does make a big difference to not have that. And so when we have this kind of collective scapegoating that we'll get to a little bit later on in this episode, we don't have the transpersonal container, and that kind of makes it a little different. So for one thing, it makes this kind of a conscious process, right? I mean, conscious in this kind of magico ritualistic way.
It's a ritual, and so the tribe is together as the ritual is performed. Mm-hmm. But I'm also aware that in a way it's a palliative, because, we do it every year. So it lasts for a year, and then we have to do it again. Yeah.
But the palliative would come in if the community believes it to be real. And that's something that may be hard for us as moderns to lean into, that for an ancient peoples to accuse this creature, the goat, of their sin, and to actually believe that somehow magically their wound or their sin is truly been placed upon the other.
It's been atoned for.
It's been atoned for. And now, of course, in our culture now, we still have some form of beliefs which would be in that realm, the transubstantiation of the Eucharist, which is still thought by many Catholics to be literal. The idea that
Christ atoned for our sins.
And continues to mediate our sins and in some way lift them magically out of our consciousness.
Well, and I mean, the Catholic rite of confession. Does something similar. I've just, I've gotten it out. I've given it over to another, which can actually be quite healing.
But that to me is first of all, I think that is a later development.
Yes.
I don't believe that was essentially part of the magical component of the forgiveness of sins.
I think you're right.
But I think that the confession dynamic became the necessary component because the magical belief wasn't adequate. So for instance, I know we're going to jump a little bit to politics and the collective. So there may be, let's say, a particularly intense evangelical church, some of these fringe churches, who will profess that Christ has perfected them because they've asked Christ to do it. So Jesus has now made them into sinless, and yet from the pulpit, they will advocate tremendous acts of violence against certain subgroups. So there is this feeling that actually the character of the church members has not been transformed in any way, where the actual ritual of confession might actually have induced a kind of humility and humanity into it. But when it's left in an exclusively magical belief system, then this process of unconscious projection happens wildly. Mm-hmm. So I think the act of confession really grounded something.
Well, and related to that, it strikes me that one of the important aspects of the scapegoat ritual is that it was a sacrifice. And that's what's missing in that scenario that you were talking about, is that there has to be something that is given up and given over to, both gods.
And in the ancient world, meat was very, very precious. And often with the Greek sacrifices, it was bones, and it was less valuable parts that were actually sacrificed to the god, because the meat was so important and so valuable that people ate it. But I'm appreciating very much the idea of sacrifice and the two goats, the two-sidedness, versus what you've said, Joseph, about these so-called fringe churches where it's one-sided. If you've become perfected, there is no need to confess or to acknowledge one's own
because then you're
less developed parts.
You're in identification with an archetype.
Yes.
If you think you're perfect.
Yes.
And then you really are not in touch at all with shadow. It seems to me like the whole question of the scapegoat is, what do we do with shadow? What is the right place with shadow?
Let's talk about what is shadow. And that is one of the key Jungian terms for all of the stuff, the material of what we don't want to be and what we can be very unconscious of. We're not greedy, we're not needy, we're not weak, we're not vulnerable. The list goes on and on and on. And these things can be so important for us to not be, that we act them out very unconsciously.
And that shadow is defined predominantly through the environment. So our immediate family tells us what is acceptable or unacceptable in our personalities. Our school systems do, our churches do, our countries do. So shadow is created very much through the power of what is considered normal or virtuous in the individual culture.
And one of the key pieces, one of the things we do in Jungian analytic work, is to help people become conscious of what is in their shadow and to give it a place in consciousness so that it doesn't get acted out, but to own and acknowledge and feel the feelings involved with being greedy, for example, or being needy, being vulnerable, not knowing. If we can give those pieces of ourselves, and we all have them, an acceptance and a befriending, then we do not have to act them out.
So the idea that we're not acting them out and containing them is still in some ways in service to the culture and in service to the superego, so that you will know that you can be greedy, but you'll still be a good girl. There's a way in which I kind of hear that in the way that that's phrased. But I think that there's another dimension of wanting to face our shadow and acknowledge it, which is in service to wholeness. Because when the child is born, the psyche is in relationship to all of its potential. And what creates shadow is this adaptation to culture. But in order to do that, parts of the original wholeness of the personality are truncated and cut off. So by facing the shadow and admitting it, it is in service to becoming a whole being again, irrespective of what the culture values or does not value or calls sinful or not, which is particularly relevant in the case of sexual identity. Because the culture or the parents or the church may always tell that kid it's never right to be gay, but in service to the wholeness of the self, the child reclaims that aspect of their sexuality. Well, and it isn't about containing it.
But you can't romanticize this either, because part of our original wholeness is the capacity, for example, to, commit murder. And that is something, I mean, there is this way in which having to cut off parts of ourselves and stick it in the shadow is a necessary wounding. And there are things that have to be contained. And part of the process with doing shadow work is to sort of discern what part do I need to claim and make conscious and live into, and what parts do I just need to know are there, but they better not see the light of day. Because each of us has in us the capacity to do great evil. Absolutely.
But I would still say that evil is relative to the culture. I'm not advocating that we all just do anything occurs to us. But even if we look at this idea of what we call murder in our culture in the United States, in a more ancient culture, the idea of physical violence or a warring tribe coming over and annihilating another tribe, which we might call murder, that was considered both heroic and acceptable.
Of course, but to live in human society, there have to be rules, right? And you know, this kind of brings us back to the scapegoat, that the society gets to define the rules by which it lives, and that will impact how, you know, what material winds up in the shadow. It doesn't mean that it isn't right for some of that material to remain contained, though, you know.
But the idea about it in containing it is very different from repressing it. If we can become conscious of our inner thief or our inner murderer or our inner anything else, then we're much less likely to live it out. And I would contend that a lot of what goes into shadow is more than simply what is defined by culture. I think some of it is our own innate nature to do things that are gratifying to us, to not be conscious of, to be self-serving, self-centered, that it's more than just culturally established norms.
But speaking of it in terms of culturally established norms for just a second, let's look at how scapegoating happens on a collective level.
Okay.
Should we do that?
Yes.
What does that bring up for either of you?
The topic that we were all started with is what we're observing now in the culture, which is that the idea of the immigrant, and particularly, let's just say, Mexican immigrants, because that's in the news an awful lot, that there's a story about Mexican immigrants and what that's mobilizing right now in the current administration.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very common that scapegoat dynamics come up with the so-called other. So, you know, and that obviously is true throughout history. So, you know, there's the Spanish driving out the Jews and the Moors at the end of the 15th century. You know, of course, the Jews in Germany in the middle of the last century. You know, it goes, I mean, we could just come up with example after example after example.
But what I'm aware of here is that it's the other who is nearby.
Yes.
It's not, you know, we're not worried about the Ethiopians or the Moroccans or the Brazilians or something. We're worried about the other that is uncomfortably close to us. And Mexico has such proximity to the United States as part of the same land mass. And the Jews were part of German society. They were right there. So it's the shadow that is right close by, right there.
And it, you know, I mean, honestly, Germany provides such a great example of this, of course, because, you know, part of the way that all got rolling is there was a lot of economic distress. After World War I, Germany was in terrible shape. And, you know, people like to be able to blame their problems on someone. And Hitler mobilized that by saying, you know, the Jews betrayed us in World War I. They betrayed us, you know, the Jews and the socialists were the first thing he sort of targeted. It's sort of their fault. That's why you're suffering. And I think we see that in politics now, too, that we can sort of blame economic distress on the other. They're coming to take our jobs or whatever it is.
And I think I have to at least make mention of the group that has been the subject of so much scapegoating, and that is African Americans in our society. They have been our shadow.
Oh, absolutely.
And we are still living with the task, I believe, in this country of acknowledging the harm and all of the hardships that were projected onto African Americans. Today, very much, of course, it's Mexicans because it's in the news all the time.
Well, I think as I'm just resting into the discourse as we're hearing it, in the collective and the media right now, that the accusations delivered regarding the current Mexican immigrants is that they're taking our jobs, they're taking resources from kind of white working class America, which comes to the blaming issue, which I think is less of a scapegoating issue. That's more about the political mobilization of suffering and tethering it to a false cause, which is this use of non sequiturs to manipulate politically, which is a whole other idea that we could unpack in a podcast, is the incredible power of the use of non sequiturs. That said, where I think the shadow projection is coming forward is accusing the immigrants of being criminals.
Yes.
That's the specific scapegoating, because what it says is that white working class America are not criminals. They're fine, upstanding, kind of pioneers of the culture. And these other people are carrying these thieving, violent, and the leader of the country is even calling them rapists. Mm-hmm. They rape people, they do this, they do terrible, terrible things, which of course the working class white Americans never do. And that's more of a classic example of laying a sin upon another culture and then wanting to injure them or cage them, which is happening, sacrifice them.
Well, and of course that happened in Germany too, with, the Jews being blamed for the blood libel, or if there was illness, the Jews poisoned the well or whatever. So,
well, the blood libel is a horrific historic story, which actually occasionally resurfaces in different parts of the world, shockingly.
Mm-hmm. Say what that is.
So the blood libel was that the Jews were killing infants and using their blood for their Sabbaths, which now seems absurd in American culture. But in the medieval world, let's say if a small infant died in the community, there was a way in which that would be a point of accusation. Now, more cunning members of the community might acquire a recently deceased infant, and it winds up, in the basement of a local wealthy Jew, who then is dragged off with the blood libel, and all of their resources are absorbed by the community, or anybody can get their hands on it. So there's different levels of nefarious behavior towards this object of envy.
That's envy, bringing an envy into this idea of the scapegoat. But there is a way that, in some sense, this desire to kind of put our dark side on someone else is a very natural thing. It's associated with projection. And there is a way that it could be healthy if it's related to the right way, right? We get to know things first through projection, and projection is normal. But it's then like, what do we do with that?
So, because in the heat of the conversation to this point, saying that this can be constructive, we have to unpack that so people don't think we're encouraging the current behavior. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, as Jung said, it's totally normal to project. This is how we meet contents first. Okay. So we might first discover that we are capable of being annoying and obnoxious and irritating because someone around us is really irritating us. And we could either sort of lash out at that person, or we could get curious about it and become more conscious and ask ourselves, where is that in me? So for example, there's a lot of scapegoating going on in our country right now in all kinds of ways. And, I'll just say that I kind of lean left. So our current president can kind of get under my skin a little bit. And what I do with that is I think, where is that in me? I need to get to know my inner Trump.
instead of scapegoating
That's right.
our president.
That's right.
It's very hard to do, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
We can really be convinced that a certain person or people or group of people are really not up to snuff, don't meet our standard, aren't good enough.
I think when we catch ourselves scapegoating, we, of course, want to become curious about that.
Well, and that is a theme, isn't it, in Jungian work, is to be curious, to want to know more about parts of ourselves, other people, the world, instead of quickly leaping to a judgment which absolves us of the responsibility to think.
Right, because then the bad is all out there.
Yes.
And I'm virtuous.
And
that's part of the scapegoating dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's intellectual laziness. Isn't it easy just to blame them, whoever the them happens to be in the moment? It's so much easier. And it's lazy of any of us to slap a label on and to play the scapegoating or blame game rather than thinking about, wait a minute, what's this about? Is it really true? What part of me is this telling me about?
Yeah, why is this, bringing up such strong feelings in me?
Yes.
That's the way to, I don't know, take the sins off the head of the poor goat or something like that.
Well, it's laziness and it's anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Because when something is rejected in the personality, what blocks the path to knowing that about ourselves is a defensive anxiety. So it may be that the mind is lazy, but also as the mind approaches the consideration that something distasteful could be true about oneself, we meet this kind of monstrous anxiety that tries to throw us backwards and avoid facing this aspect.
I mean, it's very important to have this sort of sense of ourselves as what we know ourselves to be. So if we feel like we're good people who most of the time do the right thing, opening up to the possibility that we might have another side.
It takes a lot of moral fortitude as well as intellectual curiosity and courage.
Yes. And the ability to do what Jung called, holding the tension of the opposites. Jung said that the shadow leads straight to hell, and we each have that within us. So doing shadow work and sort of taking responsibility for those sins that we would like to cast on another is not for the faint of heart.
I'm really interested in what you said, Joseph, about anxiety and the role that anxiety plays in scapegoating people, groups of people. What are we afraid of? What are we really afraid of? We're afraid, what I read in the press is, the trope is that Mexicans are taking jobs that deprive white Americans of work.
And yet the statistic is that our unemployment is lower now than it's been in 25 years.
Exactly.
So where's all this fear coming from?
Exactly. What is really underneath the content? What are people afraid of? What is the threat that this group of people who are labeled other pose? What's really going on here?
Well, it's, it is a way that we can, fear can mobilize this sort of projection that happens in scapegoating, and it can feel like a way to purge ourselves from unwanted contents.
So I'm still curious as to what we are afraid of when there is a group of people who are other. What were the Germans really afraid of in the Jewish community? What are we currently seem to be so hysterical, if I may use that word, about vis-a-vis Mexicans, and whether we call them undocumented workers or illegal aliens or whatever other term we can
I'm also
concoct.
thinking about what happened in Bosnia and Rwanda in the 90s. It's sort of similar dynamics there. There was an inner other who needed to be wiped out.
So it seems to have something to do with power, and that there's only so much of resource to go around, whatever that resource is. And if you, whoever the you is, have more of it, then there's less for me. I'm afraid that I'll be deprived. I'm afraid I'll be done out of a job. I'm afraid I'll be somehow without the kind of resources that I need due to whatever the other happens to be at the time.
In that way of
threatened.
thinking,
Yeah.
we're kind of moving a little bit out of the scapegoat and more into this competition for resources and the idea of who are my kin, who gets to survive and flourish, and who is the out group, which is a very primal idea about preserving one's lineage and even genetic integrity in terms of who is going to gobble up the resources and who do I have to compete with for that?
Yeah, I think that is really primal. And it's probably, if you looked, you could probably see that it was nearly universal, unfortunately, things like that. And
it's still universal in the animal kingdom.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes from a reservoir of instinct.
Yeah, it probably does. And I think that the archetype of the scapegoat kind of serves that, because that's part of how we dehumanize the other to make it possible to carry out things like that, right? So there's some way that those can work in tandem.
It could be, but I want to bring us back to the seduction of virtue, because I think that is specific to the scapegoat.
Yeah, and it's a great phrase, and I think it's very relevant now in our culture.
And something you had brought up, but I don't think we came to fully yet, is the idea of the scapegoat archetype has the capacity to actually serve a valid function in the culture. And archetypes are bipolar, so archetypes can be horrifying in their application, but they can also be helpful in other applications. So I don't think we have talked enough about the helpful side of the scapegoat. So one of the things that I found my mind going back to is the kind of developmental splitting that very young children need to do. That there is a way in which a child, when they begin to absorb what the norms in the family are, will go through a period of time of accusing the dog of doing certain things, but they didn't do it.
Yeah.
Or accusing a doll of doing something naughty. And then they'll scold the doll so that they can be virtuous, but the thing that they actually were doing a minute ago is the doll's fault, or maybe mommy's fault, or daddy's fault. But you can actually see in service to formulating a virtuous core, splitting and scapegoating happens as a natural developmental process. With your writings on motherhood, I would imagine this is something that's a very rich observation.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true, and I think it goes back to something I said a minute ago, that we do need to have this sort of core sense of self that we're okay. We have to have a sense of our okayness. And when that gets threatened, if it's not, especially if we're not on real stable ground with it, if it gets threatened a little bit, like, wow, I do have these sort of shadowy desires of aggression or greed or sexuality or other things, it's like sort of, can we hold that, or do we need to expel it?
And are there times developmentally where we must divorce ourselves from it because the ego is not strong enough to hold it? So a little kid, a 3 or 4-year-old kid, they do need to make the doll bad because they don't have enough power yet. They don't have enough
ego strength
to be able to admit, oh gosh, sometimes I'm really selfish, or sometimes I steal something and hide it. That's too much tension for a child to hold. And if we use that model, there are many adults who still function with inadequate ego strength and from a child perspective, which then makes them feel like they have to maintain the self-image of virtue, project these terrible aspects onto another person because they don't feel or really don't have the strength. So in their internal psychological economy or ecology, it seems helpful to them to put the tense, conflictual, horrible things on immigrants, onto Jews, onto whoever they're talking about, because they are fundamentally too weak.
So what you're saying here is, I think, a couple of things. One is we're moving into the collective level of what scapegoating looks like. in the service of ego development, in the sense of young children who do need to split off badness onto their stuffed animal or doll or sibling. And then that can carry forward unhelpfully into adulthood.
Tragically.
What served as a 6-year-old, let's say, no longer serves as a 36-year-old or a 26-year-old.
And is dangerous to continue to happen.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pick that up, and I think you're right. But I don't know if you spend as much time on social media as I do, but boy, there is a ton of this going on social media. You talk about the seduction of virtue. There are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that think they've got the answer right and that they're virtuous, God damn it, and that if you disagree with them, they'll just excoriate you on Twitter. And everyone's doing this, everyone's doing it to each other. And it's happening, I think, in a way that is dangerous in our public discourse, where the other person is all wrong and even evil for holding certain thoughts. And I think that as Jungians, we have to kind of model holding the space to hold the tension of the opposites.
It seems to me that this takes place a lot. I'm going back to Joseph's idea of anxiety, that we live in anxious times.
Mm-hmm.
And so the heat has been turned up and with the polarities have gotten more extreme of my group good, your group bad.
Well, it's interesting that people always talk about political tribalism because, of course, like scapegoating is very much associated with sort of tribal. I mean, it arose out of a tribal culture. And,
yes.
It's interesting because we could talk about tribalism and polarization. That could be whole other episodes, and perhaps they will be. But it's interesting how the topic of the scapegoat led us there.
And it seems that ideally, as our hypothetical scapegoating, splitting off child grows up, that at some point in adulthood, there would be the ability to hold the tension of those opposites, to see both sides, and that's not happening as much as we would like for it to happen in today's culture, that the splits have gotten more intense, more polarized, more black and white, good, bad, right, wrong.
I would like to move this, if I may, into a slightly different direction.
Okay.
And talk about how the issue of the scapegoat comes into the consulting room.
How we see it clinically.
Yeah, because this is definitely a dynamic that I'm very aware of with many people that come in. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think that people that wind up kind of becoming the scapegoat in families or in other small systems are oftentimes the people who are capable of seeing through dynamics. They notice more things. They see maybe that they feel things more deeply. They see that mom is kind of numbing herself out or whatever it is. And then there's this sense, and this is where the scapegoat complex is related, I think, to the Cassandra complex, which is something else we could talk about. It's like, if you know my dirty secret, then I have to get rid of you because I don't want to be reminded about what I'm trying to repress.
Right.
Divorce
myself from. Yes.
Just to add what Cassandra complex is, Cassandra was cursed by Apollo for not being willing to engage sexually with him. The curse was that she would know things. She would have the gift of prophecy and truth, and no one would believe her. So you're saying that the child or kid in school who is scapegoated is often one who sees things that are inconveniently true.
Yes.
Who is the truth teller in the situation?
Yes.
But this one, even somebody who's just the observer, I don't know if you guys remember, but years ago, there was a wonderful movie called The Madness of King George.
Oh, it was such a great movie.
It's a great movie. So King George has this very obscure disorder where his urine will turn blue, which is actually a literal disorder. And it causes, I believe it's ammonia to back up in the brain, which causes delirium that way. And he would move in and out of this problem. So in the movie, they kind of depict King George going into one of his delirious episodes, and all of his very seasoned advisors distance themselves from him because they don't want to be remembered as someone who saw him in that state. But one stalwart, virtuous young man, pins himself to King George and is there with him when he's disassembled and he's wild. And then he returns to his sane self and looks at this guy that observed him in those states and fundamentally banishes him from court.
That's right. Yes.
Which is exactly what you're talking about.
It's funny because I was going to bring in another movie example too, which is it's another older movie, is Ordinary People. Do you guys remember that one?
Oh yes, absolutely.
So, if you remember the setup of the movie, the favorite son has drowned. Yes. That's like the one that was sacrificed to Yahweh, right? He's gone. And anyway, and then there's the brother who has kind of come unraveled in the aftermath of his brother's death. He's been hospitalized, he's in therapy, he's not functioning well, but Mary Tyler Moore brilliantly plays this very brittle persona identified person who, she's upset about the shoes that her husband wears to the kid's funeral. She's worried about the bloodstains getting in the grout. The movie makes it really clear that she's not in touch with her own grief. And the kid, I can't remember the name of the kid right now, but the central figure is this young man, and he is feeling all the grief, the split off grief that his mother can't feel, and she cannot stand him because of that.
Right. So he is what we call clinically the identified patient.
Right, which I think is like another way of talking about scapegoating. Right. Say more about identified patient.
Well, it often happens in families that everybody in the family is okay, except for, let's call him Bobby. And he might be the same, we could call the actor in Ordinary People Bobby. That Bobby is the one that carries the split off, denied difficulties, feelings, problems of the family. And he's the scapegoat. The problem is Bobby. It's not the rest of us.
So that would be the member of the family that would develop symptoms.
Yes.
Or be pressured to develop symptoms. This unconscious pushing a child into certain behaviors to then justify calling them the problem child.
Right. And then you can send that kid to treatment, right? And that's sort of like, you're the scapegoat. Now go out into the wilderness of therapy. And that's going to treat the whole family system. That's the thought.
Fantasy.
Right. That's the fantasy.
And very often what happens is that when it's a child or a teenager, of course, other members of the family have to be involved. They are involved. A family is a unit, is an intimate system. So you don't just isolate one part of the family and say, yes, indeed, it's Bobby who has all of the problems. You want to look at how Bobby relates to his mother, his brother, his sister, his father, and whoever else may be living in the home, and eventually ask other members of the family, not directly, but by lifting up what's going on, to take some responsibility for what else is happening in the family.
Right. So if you're the scapegoated child, if you're the identified patient and your family takes you to a good family therapist, the family therapist will do this thing where he invites the entire system to share in the working through of whatever the sins are. I'm using air quotes. But a lot of times that doesn't happen. And so that identified patient grows up into an adult who's been identified with the scapegoat archetype and walks into one of our offices. So what does that look like?
Well, there are two elements that I'm very interested in if the scapegoat archetype is active in the person. One is they feel very mistreated, and they feel accused of and assigned terrible qualities by the bullies in the family, by the bullies in their lives. But on a deeper level, I will often observe that the object of accusations often adopts the power of the accuser. And this comes back to the idea of Azazel, who was also called the accusing angel. tethering it back, there was an idea that when you got to heaven and you stood before the throne of the Almighty, that one angel would advocate for you and speak to your virtues, and another angel would accuse you of all your failings, which was also associated with Azazel. So I find that the scapegoat is often the fastest to accuse ferociously other people of any number of things, which, by the way, shows up politically as whataboutism. The idea that, oh, you actually have this problem in your personality. Well, what about so-and-so over here who's doing this thing? This idea of moving the power of accusation, which, by the way, is very powerful. To accuse somebody in our culture is very, very powerful. To accuse somebody in the family and to be accused of something, irregardless of its veracity, is very powerful.
It can ruin people. And I mean, we're absolutely seeing this, and unless I rain down hate and vitriol, I mean, where it's happening with me too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're just by dint of being accused, some people who may be totally innocent are having their lives ruined, So yes, so this sort of ferocious, righteous kind of the power of outrage and accusing, it is kind of wrapped up in this scapegoat archetype. So what you're saying is someone comes in and they've been the scapegoat, and the sort of the underbelly of being the victim of this is that they might be just as quick to accuse someone else. Is that what you're getting
Absolutely.
at, Joseph?
And the power, how I like to imagine it, is that when Azazel is invoked, when the accusation flies to the other person, it's as if this magnetic substance is deposited in the scapegoat that then continues to attract the same accusational potencies and violence. And that person, when they turn and accuse someone else, is able to deposit that same kind of magnetic force, power, into the other person, which then accumulates this kind of collective desire to accuse them. And that's a way of, I imagine, this transmission of destruction that happens. And why in ancient cultures, like in Judaism, the penalty for slandering was sometimes execution or banishment from the tribe.
Wow, I didn't know that.
That to be a slanderer, to make a false accusation was considered a horrendous crime.
What I'm thinking about is that this is what happens in the interpersonal axis. I always think of it as a horizontal axis, is that it gets projected onto someone else who's accused of by the person who has himself or herself felt victimized and bullied. But what I think we're often working with is what happens inside just that person, that there are those two elements of the part of, let's say, me that feels victimized and has felt scapegoated, and the part of me that then wants to lash out, and that I then become both, or a person can become both, the scapegoater and the scapegoatee, so to speak.
Yeah, and there's other dynamics here too. I mean, first of all, we're sort of lifting up these different pieces, but it's worth saying that a lot of people who've had this experience in childhood of being the scapegoat, of being the person who saw, that they are often quite soulful adults. And that's why I think they often find their way to our offices, and they often do feel things very deeply. And they are carrying the sins of the family, and that is a big burden, and it is very painful. So, working through that is sort of, there's a lot that's involved in working through that, but I think some of it is connecting with healthy aggression and sort of finding that ability to sort of say, no, that's not mine. You have to kind of connect with healthy aggression, which can be really hard. But another thing that happens is that people who become identified with being the scapegoat, there's a kind of negative inflation. It's an important role to play, and you can become sort of invested in it because it does give you an important role in the family, not a pleasant one, but an important one.
Yes, I've heard people in my office say, yeah, I'm the family fuck up, followed by gales of laughter and this kind of devilish delight.
Yeah.
which I think it goes into this idea of negative inflation, which would be important to unpack just a tiny bit, because that's an unusual word for probably a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, inflation is where we sort of get puffed up and kind of maybe disconnected with our earthiness and our groundedness, and we get maybe a little bit filled with the archetype. And, basically, what's the sort of more psychiatric term for it? Grandiose. It's a little bit like grandiosity. And a negative inflation, which is a great concept. It's this idea that you can feel really special for being such a fuck up, or being so pathetic, or, it's like, woe is me,
Yes.
and I'm so special,
Yes.
But that's an important thing to ferret out if you're working with someone who's identified with the scapegoat, because you might not initially think that they're deriving some sort of secondary gain from being in that role, but becoming conscious of that will enable them to become free of carrying that.
And the other clinical term that comes up for me is a repetition compulsion, that when it's in the unconscious, that person unconsciously serves that role and induces blame, scapegoating, negative relationships, victimization, induces that again and again and again.
That magnetic center that I was talking about.
Yeah, that's true. That's like that. Which, we have to be careful, because it sounds like, oh my gosh, you're blaming the victim, which I think is not a nuanced enough way of thinking about it. I think we're being curious about the different dynamics that might perpetuate a certain role.
And I think that exactly, that when we lift up to this discussion of archetypal dynamics and how they set up psychological forces in the psyche, that we have to adopt a very objective attitude. And in some ways, we have to abandon a little bit of empathy in service to telos, which is core to Jung's work, that yes, we can be empathic that somebody has suffered, being mistreated and bullied.
And really validate that.
Absolutely.
That is what happened.
Yes.
And to rise above that, or to invite them to rise above it and see this as part of a much more complicated system, which may require them to lay aside their personal feelings for a while and be able to see a much larger network of something that's going on.
And that is very Jungian.
Yes.
That if things can be relativized, seen in relation to something bigger, something more complex, something archetypal, like the archetype of the scapegoat, it can help the person not take it so intensely personally, and to see it more objectively, and thereby free himself or herself of some of this and move on, the telos, the trajectory moving into the future.
And coming to this idea of helping the scapegoat own their own experience of being the accusing force in their environment can help them see that for many years they have been very much like the people that victimized them, which can create a sense of balance inside of them and allow them to come to a pause.
Yeah, and because I think that what we're sort of getting at is there's a way that if you carry a scapegoat, you may be identified with a victimhood mentality, which is disempowering. And if, I think it's a question of timing when we move from empathy more to an objective place, right? Because you certainly wouldn't want to do that too soon. It's important to have these experiences really held and validated. But yeah, ultimately we're interested in sort of growing larger than.
And integrating the archetypal bipolarity, I think what we're talking about is that there's the scapegoated person, and there's also the inner scapegoater. And if those can come together inside a person, in the psyche, in the unconscious, that it's very freeing. Then you are holding the tension of the opposites. Then things are not right, wrong, good, bad. There's a recovery of the wholeness that you were talking about earlier, Joseph.
I think that's a good place to
wrap it up for
now.
today. So, one of our listeners has very graciously submitted a dream and given us permission to talk about it on the podcast. To set up a bit of context, this is a female dreamer. She is 46 years old and currently she's a student. And she tells us in terms of the context of the dream that right now she's dealing with some severe depression and a moderate anxiety over life in general. She's feeling some confusion over her path in life, and that as she recalls the dream, that the feelings of fear and confusion and apprehension were very present to her during the dream. So here's the dream. I hiked to a primitive tribal village. I went there as a researcher, perhaps as an anthropologist. As I was standing, talking to one of the men, an angry woman with a crying infant stomped toward our area and plunged her infant, backside first, into a plastic basin of water as if to drown her. Bubbles came from the infant's mouth while underwater. I started to run over there to rescue the baby, but the man or something held me back. The woman pulled the baby out of the water, looked at her face briefly, and then plunged her back into the water, this time face down. At this, I immediately ran to the baby and pulled her out of the water. I held her face down and pounded on her back in an attempt to get the water out of her lungs. While I was watching and doing all of this, I was aware that I wanted to save the child not because I cared about her or because I cared about children in general, but because I knew what it felt like to drown. Water came out of the infant's mouth, she coughed a lot, and then seemed okay. She was able to breathe. The angry mother had stood there watching me. She was now calm. She wanted her baby back, and although I felt apprehensive about returning the child, I did. The woman and the child seemed fine. I wanted to have the child removed from the abusive, dangerous environment, but the mother reassured me everything was fine. I had to leave. The mother was smiling as she cradled her baby. She seemed genuinely happy and content, but I was still worried a bit about the infant.
Wow, it's a really interesting dream. I'm already having some thoughts about it. I want to start with just maybe some thoughts about how we're using dream interpretation on the podcast. I know we put this in our form, and I think it's on our website too, but just worth saying every now and again that to really interpret a dream, we need the dreamer present. We're certainly not claiming that we're, going to get to the ultimate meaning of this dream. The only expert on the dream is, of course, the dreamer. It's certainly not us, but we're going to, think about some things and ask some questions and move around this dream and see what there is. And, our hope is that you'll learn more about how Jungians work with dreams as we do this.
And maybe something about your own dreams, and particularly the images in the dream. And I am struck in this dream by what we call just the very beginning, the dream setting, which is the situation as it is. The dream says, this is what is. What is I hiked to a primitive, in quotes, a primitive tribal village. I went there as a researcher, perhaps an anthropologist. So this is image-rich beginning to the dream, and this is the part that we can talk about of what it means to go to a primal or primitive village as an anthropologist or researcher.
It looks like you have an idea about that. What are you thinking?
I think it's, I really like the very beginning part of the dream setting, the situation as it is. Because I think it says, okay, I'm going somewhere primitive, somewhere instinctual, somewhere earthy, someplace
so into the unconscious,
yes,
right? A pretty primitive part.
Forests, tribal, primitive, etc., below the level we might assume of sort of usual cultural, sophisticated, the way we live now. And there's an objectivity going on here because the dreamer is going as a researcher or anthropologist, scientist.
And so, when we appear in our dreams, Jungians refer to that as the dream ego, and it kind of usually stands in for the conscious attitude. So in this sense, my hunch is that this is a really good conscious attitude to hold, because you're going in with curiosity. I mean, maybe you're too removed because you're scientific. That's the other side.
A little distanced.
But you are sort of going because there's something to learn.
Yes, fair enough.
And I think that if this was a dream that one of our clients had, that we'd feel gratified that they're able to enter into whatever they're encountering in the unconscious with this objective curiosity, that they're there to learn something.
Yes, it does imply curiosity.
Okay.
It also implies like distance or perhaps too rational, but curiosity is definitely there for me.
Yes.
And the first thing that greets her as she moves into this more primal environment of herself is the angry mother, perhaps even committing infanticide. Although what we want to say, because there is an interesting mythologic parallel to this,
I think you're thinking the same
is
thing.
that the ego, in its interpretation of what's happening in the dream, is probably the least reliable source of context.
Mm-hmm.
If the dream maker in the soul is creating dreams to correct the ego is probably the least on top of why that's happening.
Right. So the upshot of that is the least trustworthy perspective in the dream is that of the dream ego.
Right. So the dream ego observes a woman plunging a baby into water. And the ego interprets that as, of course, infanticide, and it has to be stopped. But if we look to mythology, or we lift this to a larger archetypal theme, it could mean a lot of different things. For instance, when the Greek hero Achilles was born, his mother wanted to save him from all harm and holds him by the ankle, but dips him into a sacred well and lifts him out of it as an effort to protect him from all forms of harm. That's a very different and interesting kind of attitude about the putting of a baby in water.
And of course, there's another mythological context as well with Demeter. Part of the Demeter story is after she loses Persephone, she disguises herself as an old woman and hires her. She becomes the nursemaid for, oh my God, can someone help me? Demophoon, thank you. And, he's a little baby, and, she's the nursemaid in this wealthy family, and she loves this baby. She sort of bestows on this baby all the love that she cannot then give to her own daughter, Persephone, who's in the underworld. And so she decides that she's going to make him immortal. And so the great goddess Demeter, I believe that she feeds him, nectar of the gods. But at night, she banks him in the fire as if he were a log. She's burning him at night, right? And it's this process. I don't know how long you have to do that. I forget off the top of my head how long it takes to make someone immortal by sticking them in the fire. But it happens over the course of time. And one night she's doing it, and the mom walks in, sees this old woman putting her baby in the fire and screams bloody murder, and Demeter stops, right? So the process of turning him into an immortal is interrupted and not completed.
On the other hand, what we have in this dream is an angry woman. This is not done out of love, as in the mythological examples that you have provided. It's an angry woman with a crying infant stomped toward our area. So there's a feeling of real fury here.
The ego has that feeling.
Yes.
The dream ego does.
Well, remember, we've got a researcher, anthropologist here. The dream ego has that feeling, but stomping is stomping, and anger and crying infant seem to be the facts of the dream.
Yes, but we don't know the context, and the psyche, the unconscious, might have good access, say, to aggression. I mean, that's the thing about putting the baby in the fires. It requires kind of acts, or in the water, is it requires some aggression. What we don't know is why. Why is this energy in the psyche doing this to this baby? And we could sort of say, okay, and what do we think the baby is anyway in this?
And what is the baby? What is a baby?
So I think, Deb, you're leaning towards a more naturalistic interpretation of the dream, which is a frame for dream work.
Absolutely.
So we could say, like, if this really happened in front of any of us in the day-to-day world, we would pay attention to the tone of the mother and we'd be worried about the baby. And that is also a very valid lens with which to look at a dream.
I'm just not willing to buy in completely to the mythological, wonderful aspects that are there in the myths you've supplied.
I think that's
but
what
I'm
we're
just
saying.
a little dubious here. Is that what's going on here? Is some effort at immortality or getting closer to the gods? I'm not so sure.
I'm not sure that I would say that it's immortality or getting closer to the gods. However, I suspect that there's something that this angry mother in the dream knows that the dream ego doesn't know.
Yes.
And that it may be in the interest of wholeness. And there is some evidence in the dream about this later, but we can work it through. Let's talk about the baby for just a minute. What do we think that baby is?
What's a baby?
It's new life.
And it's future.
Yes.
It's future potential.
Mm-hmm. and if we're going to stay with the naturalistic interpretation, in a tribal environment where we could imagine resources are thin, is every baby that's going to demand resources welcomed?
We know for sure that every baby is not necessarily welcomed. There's a researcher, anthropologist named, is it Jane Hurdy?
Sarah
Hurdy. Thank you. Who has documented infanticide in tribes of babies that are not wanted.
So let's imagine this is a psychic environment, a psychological environment. So here's a young woman who's already depressed and anxious. She's confused about everything. She's in school, doesn't know what her future holds for her. And this new life is being born in her. That's going to make enormous amounts of demands on her. That's going to need her attention. That's going to co-opt an amount of resources. And the angry part of her that will be responsible for that shows up as, politely saying it, ambivalent about maintaining responsibility for this.
Well, maybe it's ambivalent. I mean, yes. And so here's how I would work with this dream. I would want to know the age of the baby. Is it 3 months? Is it 10 months? Is it 2 years? And then I would say, and let's say it's 6 months. We don't know. And then I would say, okay, and what happened 6 months ago? And sometimes that yields no fruit, but sometimes the person will say, oh my God, that's when I started school or whatever. And so we can say, okay, so maybe the baby is an image of this new thing that has come into your life. And so what, Joseph, I like your point about it's really demanding a lot from you. That is pretty clear that is what babies do. But it's almost like this angry mother either feels ambivalent about whether or not she wants the child, or she knows that this sort of initiatory baptism is something the child needs. Now, we don't really know for sure. Here's a few things that I noticed. I thought it was interesting, this part about, I realize that I care about this because I know what it feels like to drown. There is some kind of identification between the ego and whatever this content is that's symbolized by the baby. In my imagination, I was imagining that the dreamer was almost feeling what it feels like to drown in that moment.
When we think about her drowning in anxiety and drowning her in depression and a feeling of lostness in the world, that she is drowning in a certain psychological state.
I guess I was struck by the mother wants the baby back, and she's smiling and cradling the child at the end, and she's genuinely happy and content. And
she wants the child back after the dream ego has grabbed the child and taken some responsibility for it. And that's what I think the dream is fundamentally
really
saying.
Interesting.
So if I think of her as kind of a bit of a lost person in the world, and the dreamer is a lost person in the world, and that there is this tremendous amount of potential in the baby that is being nurtured by the tribal mother. The unconscious is mothering her potential.
I see where you're going.
And the unconscious is angry that the ego has not taken responsibility for the child. And then in the way that the dream maker dramatizes circumstances, it creates a crisis which the unconscious will often do.
Yes.
And where ego is compelled to go into activity, grab the potential, the child, drain the water out, which, by the way, is a great symbol of draining out excess emotion, which is one of the things we do with complexes, is we wring out the water from the complex. So there's some objectivity. She drains out all of this watery emotion from the child, and then the child and the mother are restored into relationship, and the ego has now a relationship with both of them.
Yeah.
At least symbolically.
Yeah, that's really, that reminds me, that brings to mind a fairy tale image. There's a couple versions of the handless maiden. This motif appears in the Russian version as well as the Italian version, so a woman has had her hands chopped off. I'm jumping to the end of the fairy tale. Okay, she's had her hands chopped off and she's been banished. She's been cast out like the scapegoat. And she has her children on her back. And she has no hands. So she's thirsty and she comes to a pool of water, and there's an old woman sitting by the pool of water. And she says, can you help me? If I lean down, my children will fall into the pool. Can you help me get a drink? And the old woman says, do it yourself. So she bends down to drink out of the water, and indeed her children fall in. And she turns to the old woman. She says, help me fish them out. And the old woman says, do it yourself. She says, but I have no hands. And the old woman says, plunge in your stumps. So she plunges in her stumps to get her children back, and her hands grow back in that moment. So it's like the unconscious, very similar to the dream, actually sort of forces her to take action on behalf of the psychic children, and that restores a sense of agency.
Oh, isn't that
that's
terrific?
A wonderful connection.
Yeah.
And if we loop in some of the other myths, let's say of Achilles being kept safe, that it is possible that there is a benefit to the child that we don't know yet, that the child has also been changed or perhaps in some way enhanced by having been saturated in the water, so that the new potential of her personality could in fact now be strengthened as a result of having been plunged in the water and claimed by the ego. There's a different resolve, and I would suspect that that will be true, whether it's because the ego is now taking hold of it, but there is a mysterious part of it having come in and out of the water in a way that was almost perhaps life-threatening, but was not yet. And in fact, she is having that experience, by the way, when she comes out of this major depression, which the dream suggests she might, that she will come out in a different from having almost drowned in those waters.
Yes, there's a great mystery at the heart of this dream.
I'm just appreciating very much the connections of conscious and unconscious that are repeated throughout the dream, of going to the primitive primal place, the unconscious, as an observer, a researcher with this kind of curiosity, witnessing the baby being plunged into the water and not feeling empathy. The dream ego doesn't feel empathy, but the dream ego relates it to herself of, oh dear, I know what that feels like, but ego does reach in to rescue this infant, the potential. And there's a reconciliation with the tribal mother, the infant. A lot of connections are made between consciousness and unconscious, and the parts of herself that are represented in the dream as the tribal mother, the baby, etc. It feels to me like a very encouraging dream.
Although there's a little doubt at the end, but no question something important has happened.
Yes,
Right.
Fair enough.
Well, we could probably talk about that dream a lot longer, but I think we'll end it there for today.
We have a final message for our listeners. We'd like to let you know that all three of us are faculty at the C.G. Jung Institute in Philadelphia. The Institute offers both public programs and lectures, as well as a Jungian seminar that meets once a month. And if you're interested, please send us an email at thisjungianlife@gmail.com or go to the website at cgjungphiladelphia.org and click on the link that says seminar. Hope to see you there.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life, From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.